Hello and welcome to this tutorial. I'll show you how to do this particle and smoke simulation in Storm and Modo and render it in Octane for Modo. We start in a new scene in Storm. In the middle you can see the viewport where everything takes place. On the left you can see an item or object list, and on the right there are parameters of the current selected object. Under that there is a procedurals panel, which we don't need right now. And at the bottom there is a timeline and some buttons to start and stop the simulation or view your caches. At first we use the general settings to set up the time range to 150. Frame rate of 24 is fine, and all the other settings are fine as well. In the next step we create a granular system. We do that by clicking on Add Object, Add Granular System. On the right side you can see all the settings of the system, but we can leave them at their default values. Now we add a source, which is by default a simple plane. We can move it by pressing W or insert numerical values to the translation channels. When we now press the sim button, the simulation starts and a lot of particles are being emitted. To make this more interesting, we can shift-click on the Change Geo button to load one of the sample meshes to emit from a volume. I really like this rock mesh because it produces a nice organic emission. At the moment, the particles are just falling down and are emitted on every frame. We want something different, and that is to emit once on the first frame and shoot the particles in an arc to the right. To do that, we click on the source and set the direction values to 5 on X and to 0 on Y. In addition, we can use the single shot frame channel to choose a frame on which a single emission should happen. We type in 0 to emit on the first frame. When we now hit the sim button again, we can see that we succeeded. The particles are emitted once and are flying in an arc to the right. Next, we increase the resolution to 20 and try how that looks. We can see that there are a lot more particles now, and it looks already quite nice. But there are still a few problems. The chunks at the end of the sim are too big, and the particles do not separate at the beginning of the sim. Before we solve this, we can activate one of Storm's performance features, sleeping. This sets particles to sleep if they are not moving anymore and therefore don't need further calculations. As you can see in a moment, these particles are turning red. Okay, to break our particles apart, we can use a force. By default, this is limited by a box, so only particles inside this area are affected. We can change its shape to sphere and scale it until it fits to our emitter. This way, the force will only affect the particles at the beginning of the sim. Again, we can type in values in the transformed channels, but if we press R in the viewport, we can also use these handles. At the moment, the force is directional and points downwards. We need something else. In the options, we can set the force to radial, so the force pushes the particles to all sides. In addition, we add some noise to make the result a bit more random. When we now hit the sim button, the force does not seem to work. That is because another feature of Storm is on by default. This one affects small chunks of particles more than big ones. We set the limit for big chunks way up, and now our force starts to work. Maybe a bit too strong. So we decrease the strength by a lot. To find the best values, we have to try a few times. Maybe it's still a bit strong, but all in all I think this is a good result. At this point I increase the resolution again. Maybe 50 is a good value. As you can see, the force is again way too strong here, so I set it to a smaller value. And the noise too. And now we start the simulation again and have a look what's happening. Nice, we can see how the particles are breaking to smaller chunks and thus nicely. There's one thing left we can add to improve the sim even more. At the moment, all particles have the same speed. It would be cool if the smaller ones would slow down a bit faster than the bigger chunks. This can be achieved by another force. We can change the name to drag so we know which is which. At first we set it to unbound so it's affecting the whole scene. Next we enable wind. We set the strength to a very small value and the speed to 0. Now we scroll down to the clump size feature. I think I increase the value for small chunks a bit. Now there should be a gradient controlling the strength of the force by the size of the particle chunks. And when we now start the simulation, we should see that those smaller particles fall down slower than the bigger ones. And as you can see, I didn't record that, so you have to believe me. Now we are nearly finished. In the last step, we cache the simulation to the disk. To do this, we can open the preferences and click this checkbox. We can click the other one as well to write a play blast to see how the simulation looks. Now we have to save the scene file. Start the simulation and wait until it's ready. The basic grain sim is now ready, but we need to enhance it. For this we open a new scene, dial in the same settings as before and head over to the procedurals area. By hitting R we can create a read node. Shift-click on the file path opens a browser window where we can load our cache. Okay, there it is. As you can see, there are already a lot of fine particles. But since we are looking for a very fine flower-like look, we need even more. To do this, we can use the Upress solver. As a first step, we need to generate more particles. This is done with an Upress node. This one generates particles around each particle of the source sim. Then we need the solver itself. Now we plug the Upress particles into the solver node and also the original sim as a driver in the other slot. We can leave all values at default and are more or less ready to simulate. One important step is to add an end dynamic node. If we had another collider in our scene, we had to plug this in between the two nodes. Now we add a set attribute node. This node can create or alter particle attributes. We need this to give the particles a width attribute, which Octane uses later for the particle sizes. For this, we set the node to scalar. We could set this to a fixed value like 0.005, but we want to introduce some variation. So we use a random function for this. So we type rand at petinum in brackets, which gives us a random value between 0 and 1 based on the index of each particle. in addition, we can name the node so we know what it's doing. So to remap these values, we type in remap right before the rand function. We know this returns values between 0 and 1, and we want to remap these to very small values like 0.0075 and 0.004. Then we just add a write node by pressing W. We want to write the particles in a single stitched alembic file, so we enable this option and remove the hashes from the file name. Now we just save the scene and start the simulation. It looks like nothing is happening, but Storm is connecting the 1.5 million uprest particles to the 300,000 driver particles. This takes a while, but when it's done, the simulation is really fast. Here's the play blast. Again, we start a new scene and dial the settings in to match the other scenes. This time we are going to use the node graph again and need to activate the Geo Attributes panel. In the general settings, we set the min and max substeps to 2 and enable run procedurals on subframes. Now we move the cursor to the procedurals area and press R to load the original particle cache. Now we want to emit smoke from the particles. But before we can do that, we need to filter the particles to get a nice emission. For this we use a delete node. By activating a node, we can see the particle attributes in the attributes panel. Here's the color, the position at the time of emission, IDs, velocity, and particle width. And now we can find some rules to filter the cache. In the delete node, we can see there is an add in the enabled channel. This means that we can use particle attributes here. So we want to delete slow particles and only want to keep the fast ones. So we type in length at v in brackets is smaller than 1.5. When we now activate this, we can see that the particles are getting deleted when they hit the ground and slow down. So now we got rid of the particles lying on the floor, but there are still a lot of particles left. We need to thin out this particle cloud. We can do this with another delete node. Now we generate a random value per particle again with the rand function and test if this value is smaller than 0.95. If this is true, the particles get deleted and we should end with only 5% of the particles. Now we add a noise node to introduce some randomness. We only want to add noise to the velocity of the particles, so we disabled effect positions in the noise options. Next, we add a trail node. So what is a trail node for? We can see that if we turn the particles into volumes by hitting the P key. I just remove the trail node to show you the difference. As you can see, we have single points, which would lead to spotty emission in the smoke sim. The trail node fixes this by adding in-between particles, which produce a way nicer emission. The trail node copies multiple frames in one frame, and we can also use substeps for this. So as a last thing, we change the volume type to fog, which produces nicer results in my opinion. Now our smoke emitter is ready to go. But this is not the whole sim yet. For this we click on Add Object and add Basic Smoke Graph. This creates a preset smoke sim we can use as a starting point. If we now hit the sim button, we can see that the simulation is working. The sim uses a cube for the emission, which got also a transform node and a mesh to volume node to turn it into a volume. We can just delete this part and replace it with our particles. In the smoke origin node we can change some basic settings. A bit more substeps, and we don't need to simulate heat. In my opinion, this can look nice even if there is no heat in reality, but for now we leave it off. In the smoke emitter node we can also set the heat to 0 and reduce the velocity and set the velocity mode to add. Now we switch to the solver and boost the vorticity and also add a bit velocity diffuse to make the smoke a bit smoother. So after activating the last node of the chain, we are ready to start the simulation. But first we need to save the scene. So now we hit sim and can immediately see our smoke appear. Now we can also turn on the read node from the top of the chain to also see the particles. The last thing missing is another write node to cache our sim to disk. Again, we press W with the mouse in the procedurals panel to create a write node. This time we don't want to write Alembic files, so we type in VDB instead. By default, this node will write the cache in the same folder as the scene file, and I think that's quite convenient. So, the simulation is running and I noticed that I forgot something. As you can see, the smoke is expanding below the ground plane. This is because smoke sims need a collider for this in Storm. We can fix that quite easily by pressing R to summon a read node with a cube mesh, T to add a transform node to scale the cube and bring it to the right position. Next, we hit M to convert the mesh into a volume and plug it into the solver. Now we can clean things up a bit. By the way, I really like this feature, which moves all the nodes up the chain by pressing Ctrl or Command. So now everything should work just fine. Here's again the play blast. So again we start in a fresh new scene and again make our basic settings. This time we set the substeps to 2 and enable run procedurals on subframes as well. Now we load our smoke cache by hitting R and shift-clicking on the file path channel. We can change the name of the node at this point for better orientation later. Now we add another read node and load the first frame of our original grain sim. Storm asks if we want to load this as a sequence. No, we only need the first frame. Now you can see we have all the particles, but they are static. To make them dynamic, we add a make dynamic node. If we now start the simulation, the particles are flying away dynamically. To make them follow the smoke, we need a sample volume node. This will sample the velocity of the smoke on every particle's position and write that into the particle's velocity. There are a few options to choose from. We want the value to be set, and this should not be limited to particles inside the volume. Now we save the scene and have a look how our sim looks like. As you can see, the particles are now following the smoke. At some point the smoke will fade away, and I think it would be cool if the particles would vanish as well. To do that, we add another sample volume node. This time we want to sample the density of the smoke. You can check the values in the Geo Attributes panel. Now we add a delete node and insert the expression add dense smaller than 0.5. Now all particles in thin smoke are deleted. And now all particles are gone. I think we need a smaller value here. As you can see, the particles are going through the ground plane just like the smoke did. So we need to add a collider here as well. This time we can use the Collide Classic node. This will let us use a classic collider in the node graph. At the end of the chain, we make the particles static again with an end dynamic node. And add again a write node set to stitch alembic. Now we are more or less finished, but we add another set attribute node to define the sizes of the particles. Just like last time, we write the expression remap add rand add petinum in brackets both, comma 0.1, comma 0. And so on. I think this time we should choose a slightly smaller value, so maybe 0.0025 and 0.0025, so we get really small particles. Okay, we save the scene, activate the write node and hit simulate. And here you can see the play blast. Now we have all our caches and can render the whole thing. We start in Octane standalone to prepare our proxies we can later use in Modo. With a right click and a click on import, we can load our VDB cache. We want to load it as a fog volume and also create a geometry output. This is necessary to use it as a proxy. At the moment, this is only one file. To load the whole sequence, we have to click on this movie icon. Now we can select all the files and click Open. We can quickly check if every frame is there. Okay, that looks good. If we want to have a look if everything works as expected, we can connect a render target. Okay, Octane is rendering. That is not really pretty at the moment, so we set the render kernel to path tracing and reduce the density and the step length in the volume material. So this is already way better. Okay. And the cool thing is, motion blur is just working fine. Now we delete the render target and save the whole thing. Now we can delete the VDB cache and load our high-risk grain particles. We can now connect this one with the geometry out node. Now we just add a diffuse material and create once again a render target to have a look if everything is working as expected. And as we can see, everything works, even with motion blur. Okay, once again we delete the render target and save this as our high-risk particle proxy. Now we repeat the whole process and delete the particle cache and load the swirling smoke particles. Once again checking with the render target, and yes, this looks nice and motion blur is working too. Okay, we save this too as our third proxy and are done. Now we switch to Modo to set up our scene. As a first step, we create a VDB voxel item and load our VDB cache. In the options, we activate Generate Mesh. And now we try to find a nice frame, something we can use as our stand-in model. Next, we create a new empty mesh layer and use a Merge Mesh Mesh-Op to convert the VDB voxel mesh to polygons. Freeze the whole thing and delete the VDB item from our scene. Also, we can name our mesh to Smoke Proxy. Now we are looking for the Octane tab and scroll to the Proxy section. Now we select our Smoke Proxy and click Open. Now we repeat this process to load our other two proxies. So, now we head over to the Octane tab and we can already see that this is way too big. But we leave it like that for the moment and just have a look if the proxies are working correctly. So we just start Octane and we can see all the proxies are working and all of them are rendering with motion blur. Great. Of course this is way too big, but now we can build our scene. First of all, we can scale down the proxies. Next we try to find a nice camera angle and can also set up a background. For this I use a cube mesh-op. Set it to 0 on Y to get a plane, scale it bigger, and add some segments. We now can add a bend deformer to make a nice studio background. We set the bend to 90 degrees and use a transform to rotate and position it in the scene. Okay. Now we can also add a material tag. In the next step, we select our proxies and the camera, set the action center to origin and rotate the whole thing so that the camera is perpendicular to the background. Okay, next thing would be to set up some lights. I create one area light for the smoke and another one for the background. Next, we open the schematic and create a new workspace for our lights. After that, we can add our two area lights and add the octane distribution channels to the nodes. So now we can again head over to the Octane tab to add also two spotlight textures to the schematic. We connect these to the distribution slots. We select both nodes and set the mode to surface normal and leave the other settings as they are. Next, we turn our environment power way down to get a real dark scene. Now we can make a material for the background. Let's select a really dark bluish color. And now we are already done and ready to save the scene. Okay, now we start the rendering and see immediately that there are some things to do. So first of all, we need more light at the front, and I can't really see the smoke. And I also don't like the general scale. So I just make the whole thing a bit bigger and adjust the camera. And we also need to adjust the lights as well. At this point, we can fine-tune the position of our proxies so that they don't float above the ground. And we can also make our background light a bit brighter. I think it's best to turn everything off and concentrate on the lights on the background. One thing which helps with rendering speed is to enable the quad light option. And I don't want to have the reflection on the background, so I just disable the specular visibility of the light. Now we can tune the spotlight texture to get a nice spotlight effect. Maybe it's good to make the band a bit larger. Okay, that's better. Okay, now we save the scene and have a look at our other light. We try to make it a bit softer. I think that looks fine for now. maybe a bit too bright, so we turn that a bit down again. And now I'm going to disable our particle proxies to have a better look at our smoke. As you can see, there's not much going on. So we can open our smoke proxy and change some of the settings. First of all, we add some scattering and increase the density. We click on Save Proxy, and after a reload we can see that our flower appears. Maybe it's even a bit too strong. So we decrease the density and save the proxy again. Now we enable the other proxies again and are ready to render the animation. And here is the final result. And here another version with a bit of heat in the smoke sim.